All right, Mike, can you tell what I'm doing?
No.
I'm looking at you. Can't
You're
see
looking
it.
at me, huh? Yeah, the evil eye, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you feel it?
No, I really can't.
Oh, I need to work on it
That
then.
must be what I ate this morning.
Yeah,
I don't think it's the evil eye.
Well, maybe you're going to tell me what I'm doing wrong in this episode here. So
Yeah. This is kind of an odd one. This is an interesting topic. I don't know how many. It was several months ago that I got an email, and I've gotten more than one. Interestingly enough, about hey, can you do something on the evil eye, or do you have anything on the evil eye idea? So when we finished Ezekiel, looking for topics, we thought, hey, why not throw this one in here? I'm relatively new to the ancient Near Eastern biblical connections to it. I mean, the concept I was familiar with, but in terms of the specific overlaps, that was a bit new. But it's really interesting. So I'm glad we're doing an episode on it. By way of just getting into it here, I'm going to read a little selection from the Dictionary of Biblical Imagery, because it actually has some information on this, and it's basic. It's a good place to start. We're going to get into a lot more detail, but that's the source, Dictionary of Biblical Imagery, edited by Leland Ryken, and the entry says, the notion of the evil eye that is common throughout most religious traditions is notably absent from the Bible, though Galatians 3:1 may be a veiled reference, unquote. Now, I'm gonna not really go out on too much of a limb to say that is a dramatic understatement and to some extent misinformed. What they're really getting at here is in this entry, and I'll read a little bit more, just so that you get a flavor for what we're talking about here. Because after saying, oh, it's not there in the Bible, they have a whole bunch of verse references to different things, and some of them will hit. But the entry continues and says, nowhere is this view of the magical power inherent in the observer's eye more evident than in the almost universal ancient belief in the power of the evil eye. I'll just stop with that sentence. Well, if it's universal, we might want to think that there's also something here in the biblical framework about it, rather than just say it's not present. So again, that first part of the entry is pretty dramatically understated, really underinformed. But continuing, some people, it was thought, could bring about calamity by casting a spell with an evil eye. The expression of jealous sentiments or even compliments were viewed as harboring vengeful spirits that would subsequently destroy what had been admired. In accordance with this outlook, the phrase evil eye in Scripture is usually rendered conceptually as jealousy. Wait a minute, let's stop there. Stop the presses. You mean the phrase evil eye does occur in Scripture? In fact, it does. And again, that might sound odd because, again, as the entry says, oh, this isn't in the Bible anywhere. What they're really talking about is this magical view of it. The phrase evil eye does occur in Scripture. We're going to go through those passages in this episode. The notion that somehow there's some sort of supernatural or spooky power in it that is, sort of emitted or transferred onto the person, either from the person doing it or to the person being looked at. That's what the entry is really sort of being cautious, maybe even overly cautious about. But the phrase actually does show up. So back to the quotation. In accordance with this outlook, the phrase evil eye in Scripture is usually rendered conceptually as jealousy. The literal phrase is, thine eye evil because I am good, Matthew 20:15 AV. Well, that's nice. That's kind of an awkward literal rendering of one verse. But as we see, the phrase shows up in other places. The evil eye, or the eye, betrays the inner spirit and may be selfish and hoarding, or bountiful and generous. Eyes can be sharpened like weapons, Job 16:9, and narrowed to a threatening squint. Few verse references there. The eyes communicate the whole range of human emotions: suspicion, haughtiness, arrogance, humility, pity, so on and so forth. And the rest of the entry is sort of like that. What is, references to the eye in Scripture, just a person's eyes generally. But what we want to focus on is this actual idea, and then again, the phrase, where it shows up in either the Old or the New Testament. Now, there's a context for this, and I think it's important that we say something about the context before we try to jump into the Bible. And I'm quoting here, or referencing anyway, an article called "The Evil Eye in Mesopotamia." This is Marie Louise Thompson, who I think still is, a Sumerian scholar. And this article was in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies in 1992. So she writes just a few excerpts from this. It's a fairly lengthy article, but just left a few quotations out of it. She says that someone, just by looking through a kind of witchcraft or power of the eyes, may cause harm to another person, animal, or object seems to be an almost universal belief known as the evil eye, unquote. Now, Thompson goes on to go through a number of instances where there are specific incantations in Mesopotamian literature against the evil eye, basically to protect someone from it. And she writes about those incantations, quote, "These incantations all indicate that the evil eye was associated with witchcraft and sorcery and other evils caused by malevolent human beings. But whereas witchcraft most often resulted in conflicts with family and neighbors, serious illness, or even death, the effects of the evil eye seem to be somewhat different. In one collection, the cuneiform texts from the Louvre, number 1689, they are described as accidents. In other words, the evil eye can cause these things, accidents, situations which might happen to anyone at any time, like it raining too little, or the cheese making goes wrong, or a tool breaks, or clothes get torn, and so on and so forth." So what she's saying here is that the evil eye in Mesopotamian thinking didn't have to be this awful, malevolent, disastrous, catastrophic kind of thing. The evil eye in their thinking was something they could blame for almost anything that went wrong, everyday occurrences. Now, let me go down here. I want to include one other thing here. She says, in the Near East today, eye imitations made of glass are worn as amulets against the evil eye. So even in modern times, beads resembling an eye or a pair of eyes are known from ancient Mesopotamia and are often understood as such amulets. The texts, however, prescribe other remedies. Means to protect against the evil eye are described in various incantations, unquote. Now, Yamauchi, who is I think he's retired now, but Yamauchi is an evangelical scholar, or was an evangelical scholar. He taught at the University of Miami in Ohio. In Tyndale Bulletin, he has an article called "Magic in the Biblical World," and this one, I believe, is publicly accessible online, and he talks about the evil eye there. So again, we're just setting some context here before we jump into some passages. Yamauchi writes, "A widespread superstition both in antiquity and at present is the fear of the evil eye, that is, the concept that someone can cause harm by his baleful glance. The usual motive for this form of black magic is envy." Now, that's an important statement, as we'll note as we go on. The usual motive is envy. "Occasions of gaiety and unusual success are especially thought to excite the resentment of those less fortunate. Any unnatural or diseased eye, as well, was especially considered an evil eye." So if you had some kind of problem with your eye, people would look at you, that guy has an evil eye. Yamauchi continues, "The black magic of the evil eye and the defensive white magic against it are already attested in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. From Arslan Tash in Syria, an amulet against the evil eye was published in 1971. I actually had to translate this thing in graduate school. Again, he's correct. There's some in this particular inscription. There's something about warding off the evil eye. He continues and says, "We have rabbinical references to the evil eye. Rabbi Arika," and I'm assuming that is not a typo for Akiva, but we'll just go with what Yamauchi's article has here. "Rabbi Arika went so far as to aver that 99 of 100 people died because of the evil eye. An exception to the ban on work on the Sabbath was the uttering of a spell against the evil eye." You could do that. That wasn't too much work. "A man could take his right thumb in the left hand and vice versa and say for protection, 'I, person, son of another person, come from the seed of Joseph against whom the evil eye has no power,'" unquote. The belief persisted among Jews in the Middle Ages. Rashi reported that a man could call his handsome son Ethiop, that's Ethiop, which was the equivalent of the N-word in antiquity. A man could call his handsome son that name to avoid the envious evil eye, which is kind of weird. Yamauchi adds, it is quite clear that fear of the evil eye continued through the Christian era, as evidenced by numerous amulets, paintings, and mosaics. A mosaic from Antioch, for example, shows the evil eye being attacked by various animals and weapons. One aspect of the hostile relations between Christians and Jews was the suspicion that Jews had this malevolent magical power. The Canon of Elvira, number 49, dated to 305 AD, forbade Jews from standing and ripening grain, lest they cause the crops to wither by their gaze, unquote. That's the end of Yamauchi's section. So, Yamauchi talks about this rabbinical, the rabbinical belief in this, and then the Christian belief, and the Christians are, in 305 in this edict, forbade Jews from standing and ripening grain lest they look at it and it die, because they had the evil eye. So it's kind of apparent, that you had Jews and Christians, they bought into this idea, which was a wider, cultural idea. One last source, and I'll bring this one up again, Fiensy, that's Fiensy, in his article, which we'll reference on the episode page, says Greek literature is also full of references to the evil eye. In a lengthy discussion in Momita, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Momita, Plutarch tries to give a rationalistic explanation for why the evil eye is effective. He says there are emanations of particles, he maintains, from all bodies, especially living bodies. The eye gives off these particles most abundantly. And here is the passage. Indeed, I said you yourself are on the right track of the cause of the effectiveness of the evil eye. When you come to the emanations of the bodies, and by far living things are more likely to give out such things because of their warmth and movement, and probably these emanations are especially given out through the eyes, unquote. So, it's a passage where you have Plutarch essentially buying into this notion that living organisms give off, something, emanations, he calls them, and the eyes are especially good at this. And so that's his attempted scientific explanation for the efficacy, the effectiveness of the evil eye. Now, the question that this raises, of course, is there anything in the Bible that really draws on these ideas? And curiously enough, there are a few things that, again, seem to, I don't know if draw on is the right word, but seem to reflect the same sort of notions. Again, minus the emanations, this like energy being projected from the eye, good or evil, and that kind of stuff, minus that sort of talk. And minus, the notion that there was some sort of spiritual power or spiritual energy being emitted against someone else. So minus that sort of idea, you do have references in Scripture that sort of, again, reflect the general idea of someone giving someone else the evil eye and having it actually sort of mean something or effect something in some way. Now, I will have this article as well referenced on the episode page, and I will include it in the protected folder for newsletter subscribers. But Nicole Tilford, wrote a really interesting article in this called The Affective, that's spelled with an A, Affective, The Affective Eye, Re-examining a Biblical Idiom. That's the end of the title. In the sources, Biblical Interpretation, Volume 23, 2015. Her article, The Affective Eye, Re-examining a Biblical Idiom, she goes through, in both Testaments, the passages in a decent amount of detail for this belief. Again, how certain passages in Scripture reflect this notion that someone could look at you or look a certain way at you, and it affected you in some way. Now, of course, again, we don't have this sort of kind of paganistic idea that we're again emitting energy particles or bolts or emanations or whatever, that you can actually. It's not like your eye is weaponized, okay? But nevertheless, there are passages that reflect this idea that the way a person looks at you can and does affect you and others in certain ways. And that, again, reflects the broader notion that harm to someone else can be caused by the way someone looks at them or the way you would look at them, that they can actually be affected, in this process, in this way. So Tilford sort of begins her treatment this way. She says, throughout the 20th century, scholars were quite comfortable asserting that the ancient Israelites believed in the existence of the evil eye. Anthropological studies have proven that pre-industrial cultures around the world share a nearly universal belief that, quote, certain individuals, animals, demons, or gods had the power of casting a spell or causing some damaging effect upon every object, inanimate or animate, upon which their glance fell, unquote. That ancient Near Eastern cultures were among the earliest examples of this belief, and the Hebrew Bible specifically mentions an evil eye, for example, Proverbs 23:6, Proverbs 28:22, and also mentions to do bad with the eye. That's Deuteronomy 15:9, and also verse 28, Deuteronomy 15:9, Deuteronomy 28, 54, and 56. That we have these instances, Tilford writes, seem to confirm that the belief was prevalent in ancient Israel. In the words of John Eliot, the evil eye was thought to be, quote, one of the most pervasive and enduring elements of ancient culture, unquote. And the ancient Israelites, quote, were no exception, unquote. Some scholars, however, have challenged this assertion, finding little or no evidence for the existence of the evil eye belief in Israel. Those passages in the Hebrew Bible that seem to mention an evil eye are, according to those scholars, idioms for greed or stinginess, not references to magical practice. I'm going to suggest here, that's the end of Tilford's quote, I'm going to suggest here that the biblical stuff is probably somewhere in between those two things. Idioms for greed and stinginess on one side, and then references to magical practices on the other. I think we're going to see that the biblical notion falls somewhere in the middle there. Now let's jump to the Old Testament. You have in 1 Samuel 18:9, and a number of studies of this, and there are book-length studies on the evil eye in antiquity, even some multi-volume studies. So you could find those on Amazon or any one of these, references that we'll provide here are probably going to note them. But a number of them start off in the Old Testament with 1 Samuel 18:9, which I don't think is really a very good example, but I'm going to give it here for the sake of being complete. We have in 1 Samuel 18:9, Saul, quote, set his eye, and this is literally, set his eye upon David, unquote. Now, again, I don't really think this is a very good example because of really what we have in the Hebrew. You have a term here where, as it is in the Masoretic text, you could translate this, and I'm just translating it, looking at the Hebrew here, just sort of trying to make it somewhat literal, but understandable for our subject matter. You could translate verse 9 as something like, and it came to pass, or and it was, that Saul, and then there's the word for iniquity or wickedness, and then we have the direct object in David, like Saul did something wickedly, did something evil. He had some sort of evil intent toward David. Now the word therefore, wickedness or evil, that sort of thing, depending on how you would which manuscript, essentially, which reading that you would go with, there is an alternative form for this particular word that could be not a noun like wickedness, but could be a participle, and then it would refer to looking with evil intent or something like that. It's the idea of, really, for lack of a better term, it's the idea of having a malicious eye towards someone. And that's the way most of these articles are going to take it. They're going to go with that manuscript reading. And I don't really think this is a very good one, because you do have a textual issue here, and also it could just mean that he looked at David and the anger in him just festered. He just didn't like David. He determined in his heart to do something evil toward David. That doesn't mean that his very gaze somehow affected David negatively. Okay, so I think this one's a little bit overstated. I think a better example is Balaam, which again, kind of interesting language here. If you go to Numbers 23:13, and I'm going to go there just so that we can read the passage. Numbers 23:13. We know the story of Balaam, okay? That Balak wants the prophet Balaam to curse Israel, and he keeps trying to get the prophet to do this, and Balaam says, hey, I'm only going to say what the Lord puts in my mouth, and then every time he opens his mouth, then he can't curse Israel, but he has to bless them, and Balak gets mad and all this sort of stuff. Well, here in Numbers 23, we read this. Balak said to him, again, he's speaking to Balaam, please come with me to another place from which you may see them. Or you could translate that you may look upon them. You shall see only a fraction of them and shall not see them all. Then curse them for me over there. So the feeling you get from that passage is that Balak, at least, and we're going to look at another passage, that it goes, I think Balaam would have thought of it this way as well, but that Balak thinks that the gaze of the prophet will help him curse Israel. In other words, it has something to do with affecting an evil outcome against the thing, in this case, the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, that he's looking at. So you actually have this language that Balaam needs to look at them. If you go to Numbers 24, the very next chapter, I'll just start at the beginning because we're going to hit verse 3 here. But in beginning of verse 1 here, in chapter 24, Numbers 24, we read, when Balaam saw that it pleased the Lord to bless Israel, he did not go as at other times to look for omens, but set his face toward the wilderness. And Balaam lifted up his eyes and saw Israel camping tribe by tribe. And the Spirit of God came upon him, and he took up his discourse and said, now catch the phrase here, the oracle of Balaam the son of Beor, the oracle of the man whose eye is opened. Okay, that's verse 3. If you go down to verse 15, we read this, Balaam's first oracle. And he took up his discourse and said, the oracle of Balaam, the son of Beor, the oracle of the man whose eye is opened. So you have twice this notion that Balaam is described as this man, this person, whose eye is open. Well, what does that mean? It has to mean more than he's not blind or something like that, because there's no indication here that that this would be any special status. Hey, we found a prophet here, one that's not blind. Look at that. Now, there's nothing unusual about that, but this description is unusual with respect to other places in the Old Testament. Talking about prophets, good or evil. So the supposition is that Balaam's practice, or his ability, or his power, or his technique, whatever word that you want to really apply to it, had something to do with gazing upon the subject that he was going to prophesy against. Like he had to look at them. Again, he had to cast his eye on them. He had to see them. And so some have looked at this passage and thought, well, we may not have the phrase evil eye here, but there could be something here where we're looking at an object to curse it matters. And so perhaps this is akin to the way the evil eye behaves in other ancient Near Eastern cultures, where a prophet or a deity or some other spirit would send their eye out toward a thing that was cursed. In other words, either symbolically or metaphorically, the idea of sending the eye out is that they fall within your gaze. If you think of the Lord of the Rings here, the eye of Sauron, that kind of thing. When it detected you, that mattered. You were affected. So that would be sort of the idea here, to fall under the gaze of this prophet person, or the deity or whatever in the ancient Near East, was not something you wanted to happen, because that gave them the ability then to curse you and to affect you in some way. And so scholars, again, looking at Numbers 23 and 24 here, have wondered in what they've written about this, thinking, well, this sort of sounds like that idea when it's associated here with Balaam. Now, Tilford comments on this briefly, this whole idea. She writes, God's watchful gaze could bring aid to the one who sought it, Psalm 25, 18 through 20, or harm to the one who had the misfortune of falling under it, Job 40, verses 11 and 12. or Habakkuk 3:6. Now, let me just read you Job 40:11 through 12. Pour out the overflowings of your anger and look on everyone who is proud and abase him. Look on everyone who is proud and bring him low, and tread down the wicked where they stand. So Tilford is making the point that sometimes God is described in this way, where God's mere look is going to affect someone either positively or negatively, and that would be consistent with the evil eye idea in the ancient Near East. And so, in her discussion here, is this why Balaam is described the way he is? Like, do certain prophets kind of imbibe in this or mimic this kind of idea, where the deity in this case, in the case of Job 40, it's the God of Israel here, that he can look at someone and that results in a judgment. Okay, that idea. So is the talk about Balaam the same sort of thing? Now she continues, Job specifically asks God to look away from him so that he can have a brief respite from his troubles. The implication being that God's sight itself brings harm. That's Job 7:19. Sight also had the power to affect the perceiver. Sight could also transfer physical properties between entities, apparently. Thus, in 2 Kings 2:9 through 15, Elisha absorbs the prophetic power of Elijah by seeing him ascend. And in Numbers 21:9, a person who is bitten by a snake could be healed by looking at the serpent staff of Moses. Now, that's the end of Tilford's quote on this part. Now, obviously we could read those passages differently, but the point is, if we're thinking about this notion that either God or a prophet, someone who is ostensibly empowered by God, or God is working through them in a given episode, which Balaam would sort of fit because God does intervene there and prevents him from cursing Israel. In other words, when Balaam looks, at the people of Israel, they turn out to be blessed. Maybe his usual procedure was to gaze upon something, to curse it, but God is intervening to sort of reverse that process. Is that what we're looking at? I think the best we can say here is that these sorts of passages and these sorts of statements, whether they be about God or about Balaam, are similar to, they're consistent with, might be a better way to put it. They're consistent with the evil eye idea. That doesn't necessarily mean that the writer was thinking about what he was writing the same way as maybe some guy over in Mesopotamia or over in Egypt. But the language is, there is an overlap here. There is some consistency to it. And as we keep going, you'll see that this kind of works itself out in some other places too. Now, there are more specific biblical references to the evil eye than these, the ones we've talked about already, where you actually have the phrase in Hebrew, evil eye. You have the word for eye and the adjective for evil. Okay, so Proverbs 23:6. Now, you're not going to hear this in the translation, because the translation is basically going to obscure this kind of language, because it's not going to be rendering it literally. It's going to be rendering the phrase interpretively. And just on a recent podcast episode, we talked about translation and how difficult that is, and how the translators can influence the way people think about a certain passage. Here you go. This is a good example. So Proverbs 23:6, do not eat the bread of a man who is stingy. Literally, that verse actually says, do not eat the bread of or with the evil eye. Do not eat bread with the evil eye. Do not eat the bread of the evil eye. You could translate it either way. You say, well, how in the world does somebody take that? Do not eat the bread of the evil eye, or with an evil eye. And how do you get, do not eat the bread of a man who is stingy? Well, just hold on. We'll see how translators sort of drift over into that sort of direction. Proverbs 28:22, a stingy man hastens after wealth. The text literally says, a man with an evil eye hastens after wealth. Deuteronomy 15:9, take care lest there be an unworthy thought in your heart, and you say, the seventh year, the year of release is near, and your eye look grudgingly on your poor brother, and you give him nothing. And he cries it to the Lord against you, and you be guilty of sin. Now, literally it says, instead of your eye look grudgingly on your poor brother, it's your eye does evil on your poor brother. Now that, again, that language is very again, reflective, similar to the kind of language you would see in other literature about, someone's gaze affecting someone else negatively. This evil eye idea, again, without the magical incantations, idea, that stuff. That phrasing is actually pretty similar. Deuteronomy 28:54. The man who is the most tender and refined among you will begrudge food to his brother, to the wife he embraces, and to the last of the children whom he has left. And it's describing some desperate circumstances here, and basically that people are going to act poorly, badly, selfishly. And in this case, instead of the man who is the most tender and refined among you will begrudge food to his brother, it's he will do evil with his eye against his brother, and to the wife, against the wife he embraces, and against the last of the children whom he has left. So you have 4 references here that, again, the phrasing is really interesting because it does sound similar to, or at least consistent with, this concept, again, that's pretty much ubiquitous in the ancient world, in all eras, frankly, and even, in what we would consider today the biblical lands, even in modern times, people are still, thinking this way, thinking about the evil eye. And here you have 4 references again that are kind of consistent with that. Now, Tilford, back to her article, here's what she notes, a few things that she notes about these passages. She writes, the mention of the evil eye in Proverbs is an idiom denoting a person who is stingy. Again, this is sort of the standard view she's getting into. Unlike a person who has a good eye, that is a person who is generous. Proverbs 22, verse 9, sort of gives us the reverse. Here's what the verse says. Whoever has a bountiful eye will be blessed, for he shares his bread with the poor. Okay? So that's a good eye. You're a sharing person. An evil eye is you're not. You're greedy. So the person with a bad eye refrains from helping his or her neighbor. He offers food and drink, but does not wish his guests to enjoy them. Proverbs 23:6 and 7. He strives to obtain goods, but does not share them. Proverbs 28:22. The references in Deuteronomy are probably also idiomatic. When disaster comes, the one who, quote, does bad with the eye, unquote, withholds food from his neighbor, wife, and children in order to preserve his own life. Now, neither phrase refers to the physical harm caused to another by means of the eye. They refer to the individual's moral character. But Tilford is going to transition out and say, that's all true, but it's only part of the picture. It's only part of the story. These idioms do, however, derive from the affective nature of physical sight, either the ability of sight to affect its object or its perceiver, the one who sees the eye, okay? Presuming that the eye can affect the object of its gaze, the Deuteronomic passages map the effects, property, onto the abstract experience of selfishness. Let me read that again. Presuming that the eye can affect the object of its gaze, the Deuteronomic passages map the effects, the property. I'm going to improve on her wording here a little bit. The Deuteronomic passages map over the properties, okay, the properties of the gaze onto the abstract experience of selfishness. Withholding food from another, even if due to dire straits, becomes a visual activity, a doing bad with the eye. A similar sentiment is found in Proverbs 10:10. There it is noted that whoever, quote, literally, bites with the eye gives injury. Although often translated as wink, the Hebrew verb here, karatz, literally means to bite or sting, again, with the eye. Thus, as other scholars, she quotes Zacharias Katse, argue, the action of the eye described here is like to that of a devouring animal or stinging insect. It goes forth and bites its object, causing injury. To bite with the eye, then, reflects the hostile intent of the individual, a desire to negatively affect the person upon whom the glance falls. And she has a cross-reference here. See also the sharpened eyes in Job 16:9. I'll read you the passage. He has torn me in his wrath and hated me. He has gnashed his teeth at me. My adversary sharpens his eyes against me, unquote. So, Tilford's point here in all this is that, look, we can read these passages and sure, they reflect stinginess, they reflect greed, they reflect selfishness. There's no doubt about that. And so translators, when they don't render these things literally, that's the flavor they're looking for. And it's legitimate. But her argument is that, some of the language just goes a little bit farther than that, where apparently the person who is doing the stingy act or being greedy is actually, according to a literal reading of the text, looking at a person with hostile intent. I'm going to withhold this to get you, or to get even, or to hurt you or harm you. And so she says it's not really sort of this passive thing that people do without thinking because they're just inherently selfish. She's arguing that there's just something a little more active, a little more intentional, a little more deliberative to it. And the fact that this is conveyed with the language of the I or the eyes, in her view, reflects this idea. It reflects very generally the notion of the evil eye, that the look of a person can cause harm, or that a person looks at another person a certain way to affect them negatively. Again, the evil eye idea. Now, the New Testament, we get some of this as well in some surprising places. In Matthew 6, 22 through 23, this is what we read. The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, if your eye is evil, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? Parallel passage to this, again, Jesus is the speaker, obviously. Luke 11:34 through 36 says this: Your eye is the lamp of your body. When your eye is healthy, your whole body is full of light. But when it is bad, or again evil, your body is full of darkness. Therefore be careful lest the light in you be darkness. It's an odd phrase. If then your whole body is full of light, having no part dark, it will be wholly bright, as when a lamp with its rays gives you light. That's the end of the passage. Now, the vast majority of commentators here, at least the ones I've looked at, would say something like the eyes are like a window, letting light in. But that's a modern view of the eye. Okay, that's an interpretation of the language of these passages based on modern knowledge of how the eye works. They didn't have that modern knowledge. Okay, this is a modern view of the eye. Ancient Jewish texts, again, operating from a pre-scientific perspective here about how an eye actually works, mechanically, ancient Jewish texts have a different view. If there is light within, light will show from the eye. Consider the consistency of this idea when juxtaposed with the lamp idea in the same passage. A lamp doesn't transmit light from another source. A lamp is its own light source. So, in other words, the modern understanding of the eye, light comes into the eye, it passes through, the hole there, and it hits this and that, and it sets off, this or that, part of the eye, and you're able to see and all. Okay, that isn't what the passages are talking about, because again, that presupposes a modern knowledge of how the eye works. Rather, the eye is the one giving off the light. Okay, if there's light within, the light will show from the eye. The light comes from the eye. Again, it sounds a little bit like that energy stuff that Plutarch was talking about, but again, that would be an overstatement as well, I think. We'll get to why in a moment. But if you juxtapose the talk about the eye with the lamp, it's kind of obvious. A lamp doesn't receive energy, light from another source and then cast it out to illumine the room. The light is the source. Okay, the lamp is the source of the light. So the eye is the source of the light. Again, to keep the comparison consistent. Now, I'm going to read something here or reference something anyway, from the International Critical Commentary here that I think goes along with this, just a brief comment. It says, there are several Jewish texts, roughly half a dozen of them, which liken the eye to a lamp. Namely, in Daniel 10:6 and in Zechariah 4. Daniel 10:6, I'll just read that one. His body, this is the, again, reflecting a divine being here, or describing a divine being. His body was like beryl, his face like the appearance of lightning, his eyes like flaming torches. Again, the idea of, the eye emitting light. Zechariah 4 is another. The Testament of Job, 2nd Enoch 42, 3rd Enoch 35. Again, this idea is contained in Old Testament and Second Temple Jewish texts, and even a little bit beyond the Second Temple period. That's his point. Now, the writer says the comparison, this light, the eye and the lamp, the comparison in these passages never has to do with the eye conveying light to the inward parts, like letting light in. Again, the modern view of the eye. On the contrary, in all 6 instances, it is used to create the picture of light coming forth from the eye. Again, it's just an interesting observation. The idea then is that the eye emits, what is within already. So in these passages in the Gospels, Jesus is contrasting in Greek, the aplous, the hoplous eye, single, sound, or generous eye, that you can translate hoplous any number of those ways. He's contrasting that eye with the poneros eye, the evil eye. Poneros is just a standard word for evil. They are contrasted, hence their meanings need to make contrastive sense. We saw in the Old Testament that the evil eye has something to do with stinginess or hostile intent, disregard for the person being gazed at. The way one looks at someone else affects them. It can cause them harm because they suffer as a result of the disdain or the hostility. Now, they're obviously going to suffer if you withhold something from them, or if you you do something after you're gazed, the way you look at them. But let's think of it this way: people can actually be harmed by the way you look at them, and that's not the standard evil eye thing in the pagan world, where we're talking about spells and all this kind of stuff. But we know from experience that we can be affected by the way people look at us, and so that's kind of what's in play here. We don't want to forget about that. Now, there's another aspect to this that several of the authors bring up. I think Feency's article is the one that does the most with this, even though several of them mention it, and that is, this is also part of the larger cultural picture that anthropologists and biblical scholars, who take a look at this sort of thing, who do what in academia is called a social scientific approach to reading scripture, and that is the shame honor culture, which is pretty important. A lot of cultures today operate based on shame honor systems, in Middle East especially, but you have Asian cultures that are going to do this as well, Asian and South Asian. Let me just read a little bit from Feency's article so you get the idea. The evil eye grows out of the core Mediterranean values of honor and shame, and something called the limited good. Honor is the greatest value in this society. I always think of the Japanese when I think of an honor culture, shame honor culture. But anyway, back to the quote. Honor is the greatest value in this society, and the worst horror is shame. Likewise, in a peasant culture, there is a sense of limited good. Food is limited, space is limited, even honor is limited. Thus, if someone has too much wealth, too much food, or too much honor, then he's taking away from you. There's only a limited amount of these things. You can get yours taken from you. This causes envy, and envy leads to the evil eye, the putting of a curse or spell on the one who has too much or flaunts too much of what he has. Today, Mediterranean people do not, for example, like their children to be praised too much in public as beautiful or intelligent, because that might provoke the evil eye from someone else and cause a curse to be put on their children. Not everyone casts the evil eye on others. Only envious people would do that. But there are plenty of envious people to go around in any culture. Jesus' saying now takes on a different meaning, again, in this context. It is not the light coming into the eye that is the issue, but what goes out from it. The hoplous person, or good person, sound person, is a person who has no double motives. Such a person is single-minded. No envy lurks in the shadows. What appears to be actually is. This person's gaze, again, the hoplous eye, the sound eye, the good eye. This person's gaze causes genuine good to others. However, the one with the evil eye causes evil. This one is envious of another's success or possessions or family, and either quietly or audibly casts a spell on him or her. This is a dangerous person whose whole body is in darkness or evil. In other words, when they cast the evil eye against a person, what they're casting is what's inside them. What's inside them is darkness. Now, another article by Bridges picks up on this idea, and I want to include a little bit of what this one says. Recent scholarship has documented the aspect of the ancient Mediterranean worldview which some call the idea of limited good. In a world where people believed the good things of life existed in short supply, one person's prosperity meant another person's poverty. One person's honor meant another's dishonor. The pie, to use a modern metaphor, contained only so many slices. And if one person got a bigger slice, someone else necessarily got a smaller one. In such a world, the vice of envy ran rampant. And envious people might cast the evil eye on neighbors who made them jealous by prospering at their expense, or as they thought. Hence, the evil eye becomes associated with envy. In other words, this is why it's associated with envy in Middle Eastern culture. You look bad at a person, you give them the evil eye because they have if they have something, it was taken from you. If they are something that you're not, okay, that was something that they took from you. It like he says, it's an inherently envious sort of system. If you think that things are in limited supply, and the person who has wealth or who has honor, we can't be happy for them because the more honor they have, the more wealth they have, the more whatever they have, that was something taken from you. And in that cultural system, you would look at them with envy. You would look at them wanting their downfall. You would look at them in such a way that you want to take from them. And this is where the evil eye mindset comes from and why it's linked in an ancient document like the Bible, with envy and greed and so on and so forth. And again, what Jesus is saying, the person with the hoplus eye, what comes out of their eye tells us who they really are, tells us what's really inside them. And the person with the evil eye, well, it tells us the same thing, doesn't it? It tells us what's inside them. One who envied, this is back to Bridges, one who envied a neighbor's prosperity might cast a withering look in the neighbor's direction in an attempt to undo the neighbor's success. In such a social context, the evil eye became an idiom for the kind of greedy, grudging, self-serving attitude Jesus contrasts with the generous eye, the hoplus eye. To take evil eye as an idiom in Matthew 6:22 through 23 does not mean to deny that people of Jesus' time believed in the harmful effects of a baleful look, just, on its own. Both people who believed in the evil eye and people who did not could use the expression as an idiom for greed. To make a modern comparison, both people who believe in ghosts and those who do not can use the expression, "You look like you've seen a ghost." Belief or disbelief in ghosts does not change the figurative nature of the language. So let's move to Galatians 3. This is, I think, in all the sources, again, that I've looked at, is probably the example that most scholars consider the best one as far as the one that gets closest to evil eye thinking in non-biblical culture. Okay, non-biblical civilizations, non-biblical peoples. In other words, the pagans, that kind of idea. This passage gets the closest to it. So Galatians 3:1, and remember, this is Paul's letter to the Galatians. What's the context? The context is Paul's opposition to converts, people that he's one of the Lord or somebody else is one of the Lord, being enslaved by the idea that either obedience to the rules of a pagan faith, means salvation, or if there are Jews in the mix, the belief that obedience to the law brings salvation. He doesn't want people enslaved by these ideas. Again, this sort of work salvation sort of thing on either side. So he writes in Galatians 3, verse 1, "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you?" The verb there is baskaino. Who has bewitched you? It was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified. Let me ask you only this. Did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law or by hearing with faith? Are you so foolish? Having begun by the Spirit, are you now made being perfected by the flesh? Did you suffer so many things in vain, if indeed it was in vain? Does he who supplies the Spirit to you and works miracles among you do so by works of the law or by hearing with faith? Just as Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. So, he turns, again to the typical, the fundamental, Jewish example there. But the key phrase is here, who has bewitched you? The verb here, baskaino, is rare. This is its only use in the New Testament. It shows up twice in the Septuagint. One of those is a non-canonical book, Sirach 14:6, at least non-canonical again for Protestants. Sirach 14:6, and it's kind of vague. It doesn't really tell us much about what's going on here. There's no one more evil than him who begrudges himself, and this is the repayment of his evil. Okay, that doesn't really tell us much. That's Sirach 14:6. However, the second one is really interesting, and it's a passage we've actually run into already. It's Deuteronomy 28:54, and I'm going to read 54 and 55 here. The tender one who is among you and the very delicate one will begrudge with his eye his brother and the wife in his bosom and the remaining young children who were left behind. Now, this is a different translation, ESV. Let me read it again. The tender one who is among you and the very delicate one will begrudge with his eye his brother and the wife in his bosom and the remaining young children who were left behind. The term begrudge there is the one translated in the Septuagint with baskaino, the bewitching verb. Okay, which really, think about that. Tender one who's among you, the very delicate one, will bewitch with his eye his brother and the wife and his. You get the flavor here of this being an evil eye, like for real, kind of thing going on here. Verse 55, though, so the one who begrudges or bewitches with his eye, his brother, his wife, the remaining children. Verse 55, so as to give one of them from the flesh of his young children, whom he may be devouring, because there's nothing left behind for him in your distress and in your oppression that your enemies afflicted you in all your cities. This is a reference again to judgment for apostasy, and things get so bad that we have cannibalism. And you say, what in the world is going on here? Why would Paul use this really rare term? Okay, it's the only time it's used in the New Testament, twice in the Septuagint. One is kind of neutral, but the Deuteronomy 28:54 one is kind of really gross. Okay, it's in a pretty terrible context. Why would Paul use this term in Galatians 3:1? Now, some scholars think Deuteronomy 28 is the answer to that question. And yet another article by Eastman entitled "The Evil Eye and the Curse of the Law," Galatians 3:1 Revisited. This is the Journal for the Study of the New Testament. In 2001, Eastman writes this: Paul's use of the verb baskaino here is unique in his letters. As in all of the New Testament, the verb's rarity makes its occurrence at such a critical juncture striking. Is it possible that Paul's peculiar description of his Galatian converts, here in Galatians 3:1, might contribute in a particular way to his argument in chapters 3 and 4 at large of his letter? My argument, Eastman's, will be that the verb baskaino does indeed function within Paul's appeal to his Galatian converts, but as an intertextual echo, which evokes the Deuteronomic curse in which it occurs in Deuteronomy 28. Whether through the preaching of the law inscribing teachers who have come into the Galatian churches, or through Paul himself, the Gentile converts have learned about the blessings of obedience and the curses for disobedience to the law of Moses set forth in Deuteronomy 27 and 28. Among those curses is one in which starving parents in a besieged city, quote, cast the evil eye on their next of kin. Deuteronomy 28:53 through 57 describes the cannibalistic actions of such parents. And again, we're going to quote it again, but this is more reflective of the Septuagint here. You will eat the offspring of your body, the flesh of your sons and your daughters, whom the Lord your God gave you, in your distress and the affliction with which your enemies afflict you. And here's the verse 54, the one we've read a couple times now. The tender and very delicate man among you will cast the evil eye. Again, the verb is baskaino, and with the word ophthalmo, again, eye, will bewitch with the eye, or you cast the bewitching eye, or something like that. Cast the evil eye on his brother and on the wife in his bosom, and the remaining children which may be left with him, so as not to give one of them any of the flesh of his children which he is eating. And the tender and very delicate woman among you, continues in Deuteronomy 28, whose foot never ventured to tread the ground because of her delicacy and tenderness, will cast the evil eye, again, baskaino, on her husband in her bosom, and on her son and her daughter, and the afterbirth which comes out between her thighs, and the child which she bore, for she will eat them secretly, in her need of all things, in your distress and your affliction with which your enemies will afflict you in all your cities. That's the end of the passage. Now Eastman says, if indeed Paul's use of baskaino in Galatians 3:1 echoes the horrifying curse, the horrifying curse described in Deuteronomy 28:53-57, how would such an association contribute to Paul's argument against those who preach works, against those who preach law observance? I propose that it operates on two levels. First, in the immediate argument about blessing and curse in Galatians 3:1-14, and second, in the larger development of the complex imagery of parents and children, slaves and heirs, woven throughout chapters 3 and 4. That is, Paul appropriates the vivid context of baskaino for his own argument and uses it to introduce both the theme of blessing and curse, which he develops in Galatians 3:8-14, and a horrifying image of the consequences of the curse of the law. On the first level, as an echo of Deuteronomy 28, Galatians 3:1 might be translated like this: you foolish Galatians, who has put you under a curse? In other words, that's the idea of bewitching. Who has put you under a spell, under a curse? You before whose eyes Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified. This anticipates the theme of the curse in Galatians 3:10-14, and Christ crucified as the cursed one who is the antidote to the curse in the same passage. The translation of baskaino simply as bewitched, in the sense of a harmful, sinister, or jealous gaze, would imply that Paul holds up the cross of Christ as an antidote to the evil eye, similar to the protection afforded by amulets, incantations, and gestures. I'm going to stop there. You see what he's saying here? He's saying Paul uses this really rare verb drawn from this horrific passage in Deuteronomy 28 for a couple of reasons. He wants the Galatians to think of the people telling them that they need to observe the law to be saved as casting a spell on them, like it's witchcraft. Okay, and he draws on the idea of the evil eye as part of a witchcraft tradition, like in ancient Mesopotamia, to do that. In other words, Israelites, people, Jews, knew where the evil eye came from. They knew it was associated with witchcraft and sorcery. You know, in their thinking, yeah, it was associated with, greed and selfishness and whatnot. And, if you look at someone askance or you look at someone with evil intent, it's because you think they stole from you. It's the shame honor thing. All that social stuff is relevant. But the argument here is that Paul, when Paul uses this verb, and especially drawn from this horrific passage about cannibalism, it's as though he's trying to say, for people to do this kind of thing described in Deuteronomy 28, I mean, you got to be so desperate, or really you have to be controlled by evil. You have to be like under a spell or something to behave this way. And so that's why he uses it. He wants the Galatians to think of the Judaizers, dare I say the Hebrew roots people, as though they're casting spells. They're putting people under some spell to convince them to turn away from the gospel and trust in works. And so Paul kind of wants to shake them up. He wants to shake up his readers with this reference, and creep them out, but by doing it. And, you look at that, I would say this, put it this way: if Paul's doing this, it's pretty clever. It's pretty shocking, what he's the image he's trying to plant in their mind about what's being done to them. And then in Galatians 3, he's going to present, Christ as the one who breaks the spell. He's the antidote for this. He is the one. You want to avoid the evil eye. You want to get out from under the spell. Well, the answer to that is Jesus. He's the antidote to it. He's immune from the evil eye, and you belong to him. It's just this sort of idea where Paul tries to use this image, in its horrific sense, to make this point. Now, for our purposes here, again, we're not. I'll just give you one more paragraph from Eastman. I think he makes another really interesting point, and I'll kind of summarize it here. He says, on the second level, an echo of Deuteronomy 28 in Galatians 3, one would identify Paul's missionary competitors, again, his opponents, in Galatia, not only as bewitchers in an insulting, rhetorical sense, nor simply as misers, but as those who themselves are acting under the curse of the law. They're the ones who are actually bewitched. They're under the curse of the law, and thereby inflicting it on their children, their own children, their spiritual children, the people they're supposedly trying to spiritually nurture. They're putting them under a curse. And that includes the Galatians themselves. The verb baskaino itself evokes images of helpless children who, according to popular evil eye belief, were especially susceptible to the evil eye. The implication is that the Galatians are acting like children. By evoking Deuteronomy 28, Paul has set the stage for this contrast. Not only are the Galatians acting like children susceptible to the evil eye, victims of it, but their very susceptibility is evidence that they are going under the curse and abandoning the blessing of the Spirit. So, Paul's point is, again, he wants the Galatians to think of the Judaizers a certain way, and Paul draws on evil eye traditions to do it. And the evil eye tradition, again, is part in Deuteronomy. Again, it's not just that the guy in Deuteronomy 28 who's in trouble because the Israel's apostatized, and look, our city's surrounded now by conquerors, and God said we would be punished. He would destroy the nations and drive us from our land, and boy, we're desperate, and I'm going to hoard my resources here and just kind of stick it out as long as I can, and I'm going to take from people I would otherwise give to. He's saying, no, it's actually worse than that. It's so desperate that you would resort to something as unthinkable as cannibalism. And people, again, who do that sort of thing, the degree of desperation is like they're not themselves anymore, like they're under a spell. They are, they're like zombified or something like that. I mean, it's something else something wicked has overtaken their senses, and they become like animals. They don't behave in a rational sort of way. And so Paul wants them to think about all these things, but again, to make the point, he has to draw on this notion, about the evil eye, that it's something that is more than just stinginess in certain contexts. It is malicious. It's evil. It's designed to make people helpless. It's designed to cause them harm. And again, it's not that it's not spell casting. None of these passages are promoting the evil eye idea like the pagans would, where there are spells and amulets and all this other voodoo kind of stuff that goes with it. You don't see that in any of these passages. It's really about, again, someone that is so wicked or mesmerized or desperate or brainwashed or whatever term helps you here, to think about it, that what's inside them is so dark that if they could kill somebody by looking at them, they'd do it. Like our common expression. So that's the idea that the evil eye passages in the Old and New Testament convey it. It tells you about what's inside of a person and what they're slaves to. They are imprisoned by darkness. That's what a person is. Who thinks this way and who tries to harm people, and again does look at them in such a way to pit themselves against them, to be malicious to them. And when it comes to spiritual stuff like doctrine, like Paul here in Galatians 3, he's using it to make a theological point that you Galatians, you're fools. You are fools if you turn from the gospel to a system of works now. It's like you're under a spell. And you know what's going to happen to you if that's the road you go down? You're going to die. You're going to die like the helpless children in Deuteronomy 28. You're going to be, again, metaphorically here, consumed. You're done. Okay, you're done. And again, he's trying to get them to think those thoughts by appealing to that passage with its rare language and its connection to the evil eye idea. So that's, again, a pretty, I would say, a basic survey of the evil eye thinking. I think that's probably the best way to cast this episode. Kind of like, how does Scripture reflect, and maybe we can add a word here, repurpose, reflect and repurpose, demonstrate a sensibility to the fact that evil eye thinking was a big part of the biblical world, a big part of the ancient world in which the biblical events take place, biblical writers do their thing. The evil eye idea was a big part of that. It was part of the culture. It was very deeply embedded in the culture. And as, again, some of the sources we began the episode with, pointed out, that it's ubiquitous. It's just all over not only the Middle East, not only the ancient Near East, but even today it's all over the world. And there are different reasons why it's all over the world. There are different points to it. In antiquity, it was associated with magic. It was associated with casting spells and whatnot. Later on, it's going to be, again, this idea of looking at a person to cause malicious intent. And you get both. You get flavors of both. You get a little sprinkle of both in the Bible. You get the references to Balaam, how he would, had to gaze at someone to do his thing. Apparently, he had to lock onto him, so to speak. That there's some sort of perhaps witchcraft element in that, and it's Balaam. I mean, look, he's not like the best example of a biblical prophet, to be sure. The traditions associated with Balaam, of course, in the Moabite issue, certainly doesn't improve his profile. So you get some of that in it, but again, you get this sense of bewitching darkness in a spiritual sense, and in Paul's case, in a theological sense, that you are gripped. You are in the grip of something that's just going to bring about your death. And to try to wake the Galatians up, he appeals to this passage, as awful as it is, this passage back in Deuteronomy 28, to try to get them to see his point. But all of that, again, draws on the evil eye idea in the ancient world.